Good morning. I have the honor and privilege of standing in front of you to welcome you to the annual Aaron Rosen Lecture. The lecture is a partnership between the Society for Social Work and Research and the Brown School at Washington University in St. Louis. In its conception, related to the outstanding scholarship, exemplary scholarship of Aaron Rosen, and what he meant to our field to advance clinical and practice-related research, particularly mental health-related research. But like most things, I just wanted to center on one word and promise no Siri reaction today, for those who were there last night. And that word is excellence. And Dr. Rosen and all those who've been selected to receive this honor represents significant excellence in our field of scholarship. And I was really thinking about excellence and the candidate that was chosen to represent Dr. Rosen and the promise for our profession. And it talks about the state of quality, excelling, being exceptional. But when I think about it, it's also being actionable, as in this definition. It describes it as an action. It's a feature in which this person excels. So today I'm honored to be part of this conversation as we welcome Dean Dorian Traub, our newest dean here at George Warren Brown. I'm still old, right? I was showing my age. I know. I thank the graduates, right? At the Brown School at Washington University in St. Louis, who will introduce this year's wonderful and outstanding recipients who represent both excellence and definitely action. So with that, Dean Traub.
Thank you so much, Dr. Joe. I really appreciate that introduction. As Dr. Joe said, I am the new dean of the Brown School at Washington University in St. Louis, and I want to thank you for joining us today for the Aaron Rosen Lecture. I want to give you a little bit of history because I have been learning this as I'm new at the Brown School, and many of us have never known a SWR that didn't have an Aaron Rosen Lecture, right? So the Aaron Rosen Lecture was established in 2002 as a joint project with SWR and the Brown School to honor the lifetime achievement of Dr. Rosen and provide an annual scholarly lecture that will move the field forward in social work in terms of integration of practice and research. Now, I was supposed to see Dr. Rosen on Monday, and I was going to ask him for words to share with you all, and unfortunately, he was not well enough to have that meeting. So please, continue to hold him in your best wishes as such a luminary in our field. I'd like to take just a brief moment to share some information with you about the Brown School, because as I'm new to it as well, I've learned some great things about it, and I think this will explain to you why the Aaron Rosen Lecture is an important entity to the Brown School.
I grew up in a community where a girl's education was not valued as much as a boy's. My mom disagreed. She was an advocate of education and stood up for me. I became the first woman in my family to attend college and wanted to do more. 3 of the best social work schools in the US recruited me for a master's program. I chose the Brown School for its focus on global economic development, since that is what I want to do. But I didn't have the finances and deferred until scholarships from WashU made my dreams possible. Seeing other faculty and students who look like me helps me feel that I belong. And learning from women who are doing amazing research has inspired me to pursue a PhD. I want to dedicate my life's work to financially empowering women in sub-Saharan Africa, and one day work for the United Nations. If we want to reduce poverty, women should really be a part of it. Because when people are economically empowered, they can make better and healthier decisions. And when one life is improved, families are going to change, communities are going to change, and there's going to be positive societal changes.
As you can see from Dr. Rosen's legacy to our most recent generation of social work scholars, our deep commitment to the integration of research and social work practice. So on behalf of the Brown School, let me say how deserving Dr. Courtney Cogburn is of this award to receive this year's Aaron Rosen lecture. According to the selection guidelines for this award, the person selected to give this lecture should have accumulated a body of significant and innovative scholarship relevant to practice, the research base for practice, or effective utilization of research in practice. And it's very clear that Dr. Cogburn's work exceeds the expectations for this award. Dr. Cogburn was selected for this award because she's on the cutting edge of practice and research. She focuses on programming and an integrative strategy for addressing racial equity and diversity in data science and expanding existing and future collaborations with other universities and external partners on actions to support racial diversity, equity, and inclusion. Dr. Cogburn is interested in ways we characterize and measure racism and the effects of racism on racial inequalities in health. She has focused on examining the effects of cultural racism in the media on acute physiological, psychological, and behavioral stress responses, as well as the associations between chronic psychosocial stress exposure and Black-white disparities in cardiovascular health and disease. Dr. Cogburn currently serves as an associate professor of social work at the Columbia University School of Social Work, employing a transdisciplinary approach to examining the role of racism in the production of racial inequalities in health, and she's a member of the faculty of the Columbia Population Research Center. Prior to Columbia, Dr. Cogburn was a Robert Wood Johnson Foundation Health and Society Scholar at the Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health and the Harvard Center for Population and Development Studies. She holds a BA in psychology from UVA and an MSW from the University of Michigan, and a PhD in combined program of education and psychology from the University of Michigan. I also want to take this moment, because I think this is just truly indicative of who Dr. Cogburn is. This award comes with an honorarium, and Dr. Cogburn asked that her honorarium be donated back to SSWR to support student travel to be able to attend this conference. I think it speaks volumes to your character and your commitment to this field. Her work is incredibly important, and we're excited to hear her speak today. Please join me. John, do you want to come up and help give the award? Yeah, come on up. Please join me in welcoming Courtney Cogburn to the stage to present this year's Aaron Rosen Lecture, We Are More Than Now and This, the critical role of imagination for liberation, health, and aliveness.
Hello, good people. How's everybody doing? Good. Thank you for responding. I hate to repeat myself. Thank you to the Brown School of Social Work and the SSWR Committee for this incredible honor, to represent the legacy of Dr. Rosen, whose legacy asks us to leverage social work research to innovate and disrupt. And who also, I recently learned from my colleague Ron Feldman, is an alum of the University of Michigan. So go blue, always. Go blue. And to our leader at the Columbia School of Social Work, Dean Melissa Begg, for her support and nomination. Thank you for your courageous leadership. I'd also like to acknowledge my many mentors, advisors, advocates, family, and friends, as well as the amazing students who have worked alongside me. I am better because of you and would not be here without you. To my squad, Desmond Patton, Carmela Alcantara, and Heidi Allen, thank you for being my safe place to land during this arduous journey to tenure. And if my doctoral students, Chelsea Allen and William Fry, are in the audience, you are, cover your ears. I'd like the powers that be in the room and online to know how amazing they are, and you should hire them immediately. I officially received tenure 1 year and 11 days ago. Which means I've been mired in existential crisis for 1 year and 10 days. I'm older than I look, and in the words of Victoria Monet, when they say you get it from her mama, I'm gonna say you effing right. I look fly, I look good, oh my mama, on my hood. But the body and mind keep score. The years are adding up, and I'm afraid you're getting the version of me that is fraught with questions of, who am I? Where are we going? And why are we in this handbasket? Why are we doing this? Does any of this really matter? Should I just start a farm upstate? My apologies in advance. A secret of getting tenure is that people often give you a microphone and a lot of leeway. So preparing for this lecture today has given me the opportunity to sit quietly and reflect on what I want to say. And I've landed on reflecting on where I've been and what's next, not only for me, but for all of us. When I graduated from the University of Michigan with my MSW 20 years ago, I was invited to give a speech at our commencement ceremony. My father died less than a week before the ceremony, and while the speech was printed in the program, I was not able to give it in person. I was moved to revisit this speech. Some of you know about being moved, and when you're moved, you tend to listen. Perhaps I was meant to share this today rather than 20 years ago. So as I'm doing as I'm told, I want to begin by sharing that speech. Help me remember 20 years ago. I would like to first take a moment to thank Dean Mears, Paula Mears was my dean at the time, the distinguished faculty and staff, and the graduating students for allowing me to speak with them today, and to today's true honorees, the financial lenders, family, parents, significant others, and children who have put up with the graduating students during their journey to this moment. Congratulations, you've made it. It is a great honor for me to speak with you today. As my friends, family, and those who have had the misfortune of taking a class with me know, I always have a lot to say. But what else would you expect from a social worker? Whether the topic is how to write a paper in an hour, intensive focus, or why you absolutely must take a class with Professor Savas, I have and will continue to contribute. And perhaps to your chagrin, I have obtained the holy grail of big mouths. Student commencement speaker. But I am speaking with you today not because I seek to inspire, but because you have inspired me. While my words are in part the product of internal reflection, they are largely the result of my experiences with you, the impassioned guardians of social justice. As James Huneker said, she dares to be a fool, and that is the first step in the direction of wisdom. And I then thought of my colleagues who dared to be fools and expressed and acted upon their frustration, but they did not seek to simply burn down the system, but rather sought to rebuild it. So I learned from their experience and reconsidered my desire to burn and pillage the village of oppression. I suddenly found myself conveniently relying on the words of Oscar Wilde, who said, "Experience is simply the name we give our mistakes." While I do not consider a passion to improve life a mistake, I did decide that it was not my passion to become an oppressor for the oppressed, and that there were other paths to my revolution. I then looked again amongst my colleagues for the epitome of social work. Some were yelling and posting lots of flyers, asserting individual therapy is the way, revolution. While others glare at the IP folk with an omnipotent grin and yell in return, the system has to be challenged if the world is going to change. Revolution. I often found myself stuck somewhere in between, for I thought a revolution merely required meeting the need wherever it may lie. And indeed, while there are many roads to change, I found that my tendency to swerve between lanes without a signal, without notice, blaring some song claiming that the oppressor must go down, was not always welcomed. I am, by God, a social worker. The revolution is fought this way. The revolution looks like this. While swerving again into the fast lane, I yell, just after some very affectionate social worky obscenity, I am the revolution. The revolution is me. Driving into the dawn, swerving down the unpaved road of the journey, humming a little ditty called Revolution, I resign myself to the exploration of the possibility, rather than clinging to a single path. Possibility is not a descriptor of the stagnant state that comprises a hopeless dreamer, but rather it is the driving force of social work. When utilized properly, possibility will refuse anything less than a revolution. My fellow revolutionaries, on this day, I dare you all to push the pedal, swerve between lanes without notice, and see what your revolution is working with. I challenge you to journey with passion. Hang your immobile image of social work out of the window until that ideal can feel the dynamism of your revolution. Yes, I've learned all about empowerment, and I recognize that the use of your experience here at the School of Social Work is totally your choice. But please consider this. Remember what you have read, but ask why. Recall what was said, but discover what was done. Be inspired by what was shared, but not limited by it. I'd like to close with a poem from Nikki Giovanni, Revolutionary Dreams. I used to dream radical dreams of blowing everyone away with my perceptive powers of correct analysis. I even used to think I'd be the one to stop the riot and negotiate the peace. Then I awoke and dug that if I dreamed natural dreams of being a natural woman, doing what a woman does when she's natural, I would have a revolution. I am a woman doing what a woman does when she's natural. And I'm grateful to have somehow managed to hold on to some sense of myself as a revolution and to have kept a North Star of doing what I believe matters. I'm inspired by a colleague at Columbia who once told me, there are people who aim to solve the problems of a discipline, and there are those who aim to solve the problems of the world. Those in the second category cannot work in isolation. World problem solving is deeply steeped in humility, in an acknowledgement that no one person, perspective, way of knowing, area of expertise could possibly address the complexities of the problems that social workers take on. I often say, if you take the word social and work literally, you'll begin to understand the scope of what we do. I also believe that at heart, we are dreamers. We dare to envision the world as being different than now and this. It is fitting that the Brown School is part of the reason I'm here on stage today. They were a catalyst for me remaining in academia and coming home to social work. As I was completing my postdoc at Harvard in public health, I was in yet another existential crisis. I truly loved my time there. If any of my mentors are in the audience, I did. But I also began to question again, does any of this really matter? Who am I? This was in part the result of asking one of our faculty members of the 300 papers he had written to that point, how many did he think mattered? And he said 3. But just as I had one foot out of the door of academia, I received an invitation from my friend and colleague Daryl Hudson to give a lecture at the Brown School. I had been away from social work for a while, and at that point, I'd been away from social work for a while and was returning to social work through this lecture. And it reminded me that there was a home for me in academia, and it was in social work. My research in social work has been captured in this sense of swerving lanes, not using a signal, and just moving as I saw fit. that's landed me in this place of working in several different areas. I think about how we characterize racism, how we measure racism, and how we engage racism. And more recently, have been working in a space of imagination. I'm not going to summarize my research today. I hope if you're interested, you'll consider reading some of the work. But in the characterizing racism space, I think a lot about cultural racism and the ways in which these systems of oppression function in ambient forms. It's in the air that we breathe. It's not only in the direct experiences that we have, but it's around us all the time. And I was frustrated with the lack of empirical work trying to measure that and trying to get a sense of how is that impacting health. I also think about racial projects and logics, multidimensional racism, and work with my students to think about radical healing, collective trauma, and white racial socialization. In the measuring racism space, I think about exposure to media-based racism when we're scrolling on TikTok or Twitter. What is that doing to our bodies as we passively consume the images of Black death and subjugation? I employ computational social science to think about how those exposures might be chronic in the form of social media exposure, news exposure, et cetera, and how that might have an impact on health over time. But we know a lot about what racism is and how it functions in society, so a good portion of my work is focused on using what we already know, building on the scholarship and translating it into action. One of the ways I've done that is my work in virtual reality that was explicitly targeted white liberals. Again, I'm a social worker. White liberals are my people. They're also an important target for our work related to racism. My students and I have described the practice of white liberalism as being guilty of observing the atrocities of racial oppression while failing to accept culpability. Specifically the role of whiteness and white people in designing, upholding, and benefiting from the very systems of oppression being identified as harmful. Instead of holding whiteness accountable, white liberals are often deeply invested in seeing themselves as good white people who exist as observers outside of and separate from racist systems. There is no neutral, there are no flies on the wall. You are culpable. So how do I help move the needle? We have this vast body of data, literature, empirical science, et cetera, documenting the effects and realities of racism. I moved to virtual reality to translate that data into a narrative and a visceral experience where you put on a headset and take on the perspective of a Black male as a child, adolescent, and as an adult. We created this through a transdisciplinary storytelling and design process that premiered at the Tribeca Film Festival in 2018, working with a team from Stanford, and the piece has now been released for public use on the Quest Store platform, the Netflix of VR. And in this experience, we take you through these 3 moments of a character named Michael Sterling. Quick story, I just picked that name I thought out of the blue until a journalist asked me, where did you get that name? Did you blend the names of Michael Brown and Alton Sterling? And I said, not on purpose. Subconsciously, their names were just with me and led me to that name. But in the virtual reality experience, we put you in the shoes of Michael as an adolescent in a classroom being disciplined unfairly and more harshly than his peers for engaging in the same behavior. You then transition into a teen version of your life where you are harassed by a police officer on the street and told to get down on your knees and put your hands up. You then transition to a workplace scene where you're disregarded and made to feel invisible. And we've studied the effects of going through an experience like this. What does this do to white people in particular as it relates to going through this experience? People often miscategorize or misrepresent the experience as being about Blackness and about being a Black male. It's not. It's about whiteness and white supremacy and racism being observed from the perspective of a Black male. This is not about Blackness. But I'm tired. I like this quote from Mame Fatou Niang, who says, how do you deal with the fatigue of having to say I am, to reacting and not creating? I'm moving through the exhaustion of explaining racism and slicing it in all the ways it can be sliced empirically and methodologically and conceptually, moving from documenting, explaining, and defending the existence of racism to joyful futuring and imagining. And I'm thinking about this in a few different forms. I'm thinking about whether there are health benefits to imagination, to not only seeing ourselves through a lens of oppression and trauma, in a way that doesn't force us to only view oppression and trauma and respond to that, but to imagine something else. I think of imagination as an active space between a dream and the story about a resolution of the dream. We should let imagination linger longer. Stories and resolutions come with performance, claimed clarity, whether warranted or not, that stifle imagination because it is inherently more convinced than dreams and imagination. I don't hold any expertise in this area. I haven't conducted any research in this space. So I'm in this in-between space of imagining, dreaming, and before I get to the story. And so I'm going to share pieces that are inspiring me in this journey. I'm thinking about imagination in two different ways. Imagination is radical and imagination is untethered. Imagination that's radical is a response to racial oppression. It's imagining the alternative to systems of racial oppression. The author of Freedom Dreams, Radical Imaginations says it's about how people in transformative social movements move and shift their ideas, rethink inherited categories, and try to locate and overturn blatant, subtle, and invisible modes of domination. Francisca Porcia says, look at those who are the most impacted by this moment, and they'll know what to do. If you show up and follow their leadership, you will most likely feel nourished and know what to do next, which is a fundamental principle of social work. Look to those who live and exist in oppression and at the margins for what justice should be, what it should feel like, and what it should look like. Ruha Benjamin describes imagination as a battlefield. She asks us to remember to imagine and craft the worlds we cannot live within, just as we dismantle the ones we cannot live within. She says that imagination is a contested field of action, not an ephemeral afterthought that we have the luxury to dismiss or romanticize, but a resource, a battleground, an input and output of technology and social order. In fact, we should acknowledge that most people are forced to live in someone else's imagination. And one of the things we have to come to grips with is how the nightmares that many people are forced to endure are the underside of elite fantasies. Futuring is also a necessary complement to realism, and I've been drawing more and more on Afrofuturism as a guide in this space. Alondra Nelson describes Afrofuturism as a term of convenience to describe the analysis, criticism, and cultural production that addresses the intersections between race and technology. Afrofuturism looks across popular culture to find models of expression that transform species of alienation into novel forms of creative potential. In the process, it reclaims theorizing about the future. Samuel Delaney says, we need images of tomorrow, and our people need them more than most. Without an image of tomorrow, one is trapped by blind history, economics, and politics beyond our control. Only by having clear and vital images of the many alternatives, good and bad, of where one can go, will we have any control over the way we may actually get there in a reality tomorrow will bring all too quickly. Again, not only thinking about the subjugated, the oppressed, and marginalized as species to be studied, but as the source of our salvation. The space that I'm also moving into is not only thinking about radical imagination, but also thinking about untethered imagination, imagining a blackness that's free of white imaginaries altogether. Kevin Quashie, who wrote the book Black Aliveness, or Poetics of Being, says, an anti-Black imaginary presumes to have nullified the question how to be, since we are either whatever the world says we are, or we are enmeshed in refusing that imposition. Of course, acquiescence is intolerable, and though defiance is essential, it is not sufficient. We are more than resisting oppression. That is not our only function in the world. What does it mean to be alive? What does it mean to live a full human experience? And through what lens do we conceptualize and think about how to manifest that? He also says, what would it mean to consider Black aliveness, especially given how readily and literally Blackness is indexed to death, including by social work? To behold such aliveness, we have to imagine a Black world. We have to imagine a Black world so as to surpass the everywhere and everyday of Black death, of Blackness that is understood only through such a vocabulary. This equation of Blackness and death is indisputable and enduring, surely, but if we are to try to conceptualize aliveness, we have to begin somewhere else. If we only understand Blackness through a lens of oppression and trauma, we are not understanding aliveness. Freedom is not the absence of oppression. When I think about untethered imagination, in contrast to what I've set up as radical imagination, I'm thinking about imagination as a revolution, in response to, in spite of, and because of oppression. And there is an imagination for the sake of imagination that's wholly untethered and free. An imagination that does not serve a purpose, promise, resolution, repair, or responsibility to anyone or anything. When I begin to think about the feeling of freedom and aliveness that's attached to Blackness, this is the space in which it exists. It is not only responding to and trying to repair racial harms. It is not only trying to convince people of its humanness and that it matters, which is still fundamentally tethered to whiteness. Black girl magic, Black joy, Black lives matter are important, but they are responding and trying to convince whiteness of our humanness. An untethered imagination does not consider whiteness in any way. It does not consider and exist in response to oppression in any way. When I begin to think about what freedom feels like, that's the space in which I think we need to exist. So just take a minute and think for yourself. What does freedom feel like? I had a hard time answering this question for myself. The 20 plus years of my career have been squarely focused on resisting and explaining racism. And I finally come to a point where I'm refusing to let my existence to be guided by such systems of oppression. Adrienne Marie Brown asked us to reclaim our skin and ask us if we can practice freedom together. Can we remember what it is to be alive with each other beyond suffering and survival? Thank you. Questions or no? Yeah, okay.
Outstanding. Excellence? Okay, word was appropriate. Dr. Cogburn will take a few questions. There are 2 mics here. Please make your way. Again, what an outstanding talk. She gives, as we said, food for the soul, spirit, and mind. So please, yes. If you could just identify yourself and please ask your question.
My name's Jim Meadows. I'm a doc student at the University of Alabama. How do we move from resilience and grit in the face of bigotry as our modality of addressing oppression and recognize this as a form of victim blaming, where addressing this most effectively is by changing the hearts and minds of the oppressor?
I don't think it's only changing the hearts and the minds of the oppressor, but the competencies of the oppressor, the awareness of the oppressor, and talking explicitly in making whiteness visible. We often focus on the targets of oppression as our point of analysis, and rarely do we hold whiteness and systems of whiteness accountable as the target of our analysis. In my work as it relates to DEI and corporate settings, et cetera, I often push people to think not only about underrepresentation, but overrepresentation. Why is the room so white? Why is that not the leading question? And so I think the grit and resilience, as you're alluding to, is doing exactly that. It's placing the responsibility, it's replacing the analysis on the targets of oppression and not thinking enough about the magical source of the reason we need to be resilient.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Trina Shanks, University of Michigan. And this just came to my head, so if it's not fully formed, please forgive me.
Okay.
But when you're thinking about imagination and Afrofuturism and radical imagination, I guess, is it as individuals or can you do it collectively? Does it have to be alternate spaces? Because like in the 50s and 60s, rather than having the Association of Psychological, you had the Black Psychological Association. And rather than having, white universities, you had historically Black universities. So can you do it collectively outside of existing institutions? And how do you think about forming those alternative spaces? So it's not just me as an individual having a radical imagination and trying to do it my best, but really creating spaces where, if not the whole society, at least bigger groups of people can do it together.
Yeah, I think about it both ways. I think about it in terms of the individual as well as collective imaginings. And I think those are wonderful examples of radical imaginations, these alternatives to existing structures, be it a university or an organization within an organization, et cetera. When I start to think about the other side of that, the untethered imagination, I'm moving more into this space of how do we do that? Is that even possible? And it really stems from my work in virtual reality, where I'm thinking about the metaverse, and I will not bore you with explaining what the metaverse is, but we're thinking about digital worlds. We're thinking about other ways of being, and in some ways, for me, it represents a tabula rasa, a digital blank space for us to start to build something else. And I think that can be done individually and collectively, but I think leveraging some of these emerging technologies might create a space to even begin to test the possibility of being untethered, because it's really difficult to imagine standing in this room right now.
Thank you. Congratulations on your great work.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for reminding us that it can be done exceedingly and abundantly more than we can even imagine. So thank you. David Cozart, Lexington, Kentucky practitioner. So as you move in your work, and then perhaps encourage others to move in our work from simply speaking of the racism and the issues of that and that arduous task, how do we, when in various spaces in the academy and in practice, still have the need to have some even acknowledge the very existence of it within them and or around them? How do we move forward to this approach of imagining more when that still exists, particularly when you just mentioned there are counter narratives to try to prove or acknowledge that it doesn't even exist. So how do we deal with that tension, in your opinion?
Yeah, and I think these perspectives aren't asking us to be delusional and be removed from reality, right? And not asking us to remove ourselves from that fight. I think these perspectives are asking us to not be predominantly or exclusively focused on that fight in creating space for other things. I have students push back and say, the world is on fire. We have to put these fires out. And I say the powers that be who set the fires would love for you to keep doing that and never stepping back and designing the world we want to live in. And I think that's true for us as scholars and practitioners, and it's true for our clients. And that's hard to do when they're in the midst of trauma. But I think finding ways to help them see that they are more than now in this is critical. Being able to see themselves in the future is critical to their healing. I'm not quite sure how to document that and assess that yet, and that's what I hope to do in the coming years. But I think it's true and critical for all of us.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Karen Bullock, Boston College School of Social Work. I echo the sentiment of gratitude for your lecture. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
My question is about the recentering or the initial centering of whiteness and addressing anti-racist practices. I find that when I engage in conversations about the need to do much of what you've described, my social work colleagues often think that we're talking about the racists over there, not us in social work. And my question is about whether you have found, or what do you think it will take for us as social workers and as social work as a profession to recognize that it's happening right here in our own profession, and we need to stop thinking that it's the racist over there or the racism over there, and begin to look critically at what's happening within our profession, in our classrooms and in our labs and in the communities that we aim to go in and gather, I almost said grab, gather our research. And how can we center it on us as social workers and as a profession?
Yeah, I think it's rooted in the way that we frame the problem is the way that we solve the problem. And if we frame the problem of oppression and trauma and focus on the analysis of their resilience and grit, et cetera, and never interrogate the context, the environment, the people who helped put them there in the first place, we will continue to do that, right? It will continue to be this removal of it's not me, it's them, let's focus on everything else but me. It's astounding to me that social work can still rest in a place where we think we are not culpable, that some of us think that our history in social work and social work practice has not helped to produce, uphold these very systems of oppression, and that the people in this room, we're talking about you. Right? Again, there is no fly on the wall, there is no neutral. And there's a need to shift our focus so that we can hold that accountable, so that can be interrogated, so that can be analyzed. To both of these questions, I'll shout out my doctoral students. William is working on work around white socialization and the performance of whiteness and really thinking about how that shows up. And my students and I wrote a paper around white logics, racial logics and ideologies and how it shows up in social work. So I think that kind of work and analysis is really important. And then to the previous question, my doctoral student Chelsea is really thinking about the healing work that Black people have to do, and that we can't be in this fight all the time. We shouldn't be held responsible for fixing a problem that we did not create. And so how do we turn to this notion of radical healing to care for ourselves? So it's a shift in focus. It's a shift in how we frame the problem, who we think is responsible for it, and how we think we should be spending our time and resources, especially as it relates to research.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Additional questions?
Hello, and congratulations.
Thank you.
My name's Rory O'Brien. I'm a PhD candidate at the University of Southern California. I'm curious about platforms for untethered imagination. And as a room full of artists of research who exercise creative license, who seek platforms to build and maintain our relationships with each other, and where those relationships can combat racism and other forms of oppression, where do we publish that? Where do we build those relationships when publishing is so often about the social problem and not about the world we want?
No idea.
Yeah.
And I think that says more about us than about the utility of the work, right? We have to reimagine what we think research is and what its function is. We have to be innovative in what methods we think matter, what forms of knowledge are significant. And until we do that, right, we're coming up against this constant battle. Again, I've had this conversation with my doctoral students as they're thinking about how do they exist and show up on a market that's thinking about knowledge and research and scholarship in some very narrow ways. We even have our work, we have trouble getting our work accepted to this conference consistently, right? So that's something we have to process for ourselves. But in reality, it's not my motivation. My motivation has never been a paper or a publication. I have tenure, I know I can say that all flippantly, right? Like, I ain't no worry about papers. Now, right. Yeah, the nerve. But that's a shift in our discipline. That's the shift in what we think academic research is. That's a shift in what we think tenure means and what we think tenurable is. And so I think there's some reflection on our sides. And in the meantime, you have to work strategically with your mentors if that's the work that is driving you to figure out how to engage and still be successful.
Questions are coming. I'll make a comment. Like most things, you can imagine a change in journals, editors, reviewers, new journals. So if you're going to really unleash yourself, we can create what you need. And there's a process for change. So there's a practical application of this. Once you have that sort of freedom of thought, then you use the institutions that are there and push them. And if you can't push them, you create them.
Yeah.
They created them.
If it was designed, it can be redesigned. And as part of my tenure packet, we sent out virtual reality headsets in addition to my papers, right? We sort of forced them to consider this as a piece of scholarship, not just the papers that are part of this packet. That was sort of a radical thing to do, asking these letter writers, in addition to reading all my stuff, to put on this headset and try to figure out how to go through a virtual reality experience. There's a professor, I think he's at the University of Virginia, I'm forgetting, but he wrote his dissertation as a mixtape and used samples as citations, right? So there's the form and valuing writing, and then there's also valuing other forms of expressing and documenting knowledge that should also happen. So I think the virtual reality, the mixtape dissertation, right, all of those are examples of really pushing beyond and just accepting things as they are and questioning where those systems came from in the first place.
I'll take the liberty. So, again, excellent talk, lots to think about. So when I heard you speak and summarize, I feel that this is a healing process, right? So I don't know if this is a good question since I'm up here and I'm just thinking about it. So how to be white and engage in these perspectives? What would you suggest?
I think white people need to focus on themselves. I think they need to focus on their own healing, their own self-awareness, their own positionality, their own culpability, and you don't do that often enough. Too often you're focused on studying me. Study yourself.
So in 1968, a gentleman whose birthday is coming up on Monday, Martin Luther King, spoke to the American Psychological Association and proposing, as he said, good friends, of conscious, I think that was the term, that one of the most important things we should do at that turn, this is 68 going into 70, was to do exactly, he said, we have to help white scholars reflect on what it means to be you through these changes that are being proposed. And for some might call it radical. So I do think that's a citation that we could make, and there's precedence for that. Other questions?
Don't be shy.
Don't be shy. Okay, yes.
Hi, I'm Jamie Booth. I'm from the University of Pittsburgh. I love that you included the quote of Amory Brown at the end. I'm fangirling on her pretty hard. And in her work, the role of spirituality and healing comes up a lot. And the thing that I've been thinking about a lot is where's science in that? Like, where do science and, because, we're at a social work research conference, and you said that you're thinking about how do we measure that or how we assess that. I don't have a real question, except that I just have been sitting with this. Like, I feel like a lot of the real healing work that we need to do is rooted in, like you said, healing ourselves or healing groups of people and stuff like that. So that's it.
Yeah, I think it's a question about our research methodologies and our focus, right? We know how to measure trauma really well. Do we know how to measure healing? Do we even know what that means and what that looks like and how we promote that? So I'm not the one to fix it. Shout out to Chelsea Allen. I don't know where you are, girl, but good luck with your dissertation, thinking about radical healing, and integrating some of these approaches. But I think it requires a shift in our focus. And again, that doesn't mean we don't study and understand trauma. We keep doing that. And we expand and think about what healing is and what that looks like and how that's achieved. And we just don't have a firm understanding of it. We don't have the scholarship that helps to root us well enough to even move toward practice. And I think there's practices, of course, that exist, right, that are already steeped in those practices and in different cultural traditions that are steeped in that. But in terms of thinking about social work and social work practice and research, there's a disconnect.
So I don't know how to ask the question, because I think to me you're opening the door to a whole new science, and social work science, I guess. But I'll try my best, even using the language of the your presentation.
Yeah,
you know, like how do you see this model of thinking about racism apply to other oppressed populations, like myself, immigrants? We have the problem that we are ethnicity and we are very diverse. So I don't know if my question is clear.
So I think that there's a need to think about, and people do, right? Think about people, communities that exist at this intersection of both trauma and oppression and privilege. And when we think about racism and whiteness and white supremacy, I would position Blackness, not being Black, but Blackness, as the antithesis of whiteness, and that it exists on a spectrum, and that we all have a relationship to either side of those anchors. It's not saying the anchors are the only things that matter, but historically, the construct of race is rooted in whiteness compared to what's not white. And Blackness is the other end of that. And so we all have to grapple with where we are, our positionality on that spectrum, and our experiences with systems of oppression and trauma, as well as our access and proximity to whiteness. That varies regardless of your identity and maybe even ethnicity, and is more so rooted in your positionality and how you live and exist in the world, how you're responded to by others. I don't think we do a good job of holding that intersection in our scholarship, and I think there's a need for that. But too often, I think particular groups of people who have that proximity to whiteness, if we had a spectrum, they would be closer to that white side based on the way they present or whatever number of other factors, and they don't grapple enough with that. They think only about their oppression. They don't think about anti-Blackness in their own culture and practices, and they don't think about their proximity to whiteness. And I think all of that is important to consider.
Thank you.
Hi, thank you so much. I can't even explain how heartwarming it was to see someone that looks like me on stage on such a huge platform. And my name is Taylor Reed. I'm at the University of California, Los Angeles. So my question for you is, you started off talking about the early moments of your career and things that defined you throughout your journey. What advice do you have to the young Black scholars in the room who are navigating and trying to engage in this Black imagination and healing, while also keeping in mind that we are being measured against whiteness, whether that is publishing in journals, making sure we network, making sure we're attending these conferences that at times are difficult for us to even enter the room?
Yeah, I think grappling with the reality that you don't have access to whiteness, really, and trying to be that, any version of it, is putting yourself fundamentally at a disadvantage. The thing you can be best is Black, authentically and truly. How does that show up in your questions? How does that show up in your analysis? How does it show up in your research? And I know that's scary and risky, but I try to ask at least the students who work with me, and not everyone's well suited to work with me, right? If you just really want a job and tenure, you should go work with somebody else. If you have questions that are driving you, a passion, an interest, then we can talk, right? What is that? And how do you do that? And that comes with some risk. We don't want you to be naive about the chessboard you're on, the landscape that you're trying to navigate, but you also have to think about, why am I doing this? If you just want a job, do something else. So figure out how to be your Blackest, authentic self in these spaces, and I promise you, you will be substantially more interesting and more successful than trying to assimilate to whiteness.
So it's only fitting that the last question will come from
Yes, ma'am.
Dr. Clark, last year's Aaron Rosen lecturer, to this current Aaron Rosen lecturer.
Sis, I don't think you opened the door. You kicked it wide open.
Thank you.
My name is Dr. Tanya Sharp, and I am beyond moved to be present before you. And so congratulations.
Thank you, sis. Thank you.
For all that you are and have yet to become. My question is about that becoming, the imagination as revolution. What would you need? What resources would you desire in this moment to make some of your teachings manifest to the level that is necessary for us to rise to the occasion as you have proposed for us today?
A nap. And quiet. You know, I had this delusion that post-tenure I would have a minute. And I haven't had it. I start sabbatical soon, I'm gonna get it, right? But just some quiet. And I think I need to be in community with people for whom I don't have to explain this, right? I don't have to give you an empirical study in order for you to believe that this is a way to go, that you don't need to be convinced. So I think being in community with those people, quiet and rest, time to reflect, and not just moving and doing is really, really critical for any next steps. And I think creating space in organizations like this for this kind of conversation, making it easier for our students to do this kind of work, to take these risks. I definitely have thoughts about how to do that. Just one quick example, that me getting that postdoc at Harvard through the Health and Society Scholars made it easier for me to take risks. People gave me the benefit of the doubt because I was coming from Harvard, because I was coming from this postdoc. It was a stamp of validation in some ways. We need to create that for our students who are taking risks so that they have the option to do it in a way that doesn't prevent them from getting jobs and moving forward. But there's a quiet and then lots of deep reflection with people who get it.
Whatever you need, I've got you.
Thank you, Tanya. Thank you.
So again, let's give thanks. Congratulations, Dr. Cogburn. I want to thank you for coming, and thanking Dean Traub and the Brown School for our wonderful collaboration. Have a good rest of your day.